Welcome, everyone. This is Elena Moore, and I'm Marketing Director at Sourcepoint. We're going to be starting in just a few minutes. We're going to wait for the rest of the attendees to trickle in. Just want to remind you that during the webinar, if you have any questions, please submit your questions via the GoToWebinar control panel that says questions right there. We are going to do a Q&A at the end. We hope we can get to all of them. If we don't, we will follow up by email. And Melanie, take it away.
Hi, everyone. This is Melanie. I'm the Client Services Director here at Sourcepoint for our EU clients. I'm joined today by my colleague, Michael Kraus, who is our VP of Product. Michael sits in the New York office, whereas I sit in our Berlin office, although currently we are all home officing, as I'm sure all of you are as well. I hope everyone is managing to stay safe and healthy in this crazy time. We know it is a very challenging time for everyone, and especially in the publishing industry. So we just wanted to let you know that we're really here to help, in any way that we can. So just a little bit of background about Sourcepoint. Sourcepoint has now been deployed as a CMP across many of the world's largest brands. So we help to engage our clients' users into conversations about why and how their data is used, and to obtain consent for utilizing their data in order to provide services and advertising on our clients' websites and apps and other devices as well. Sourcepoint was one of the first CMPs to be registered with the IAB and to allow for companies to be able to have GDPR compliance. And we're also an active member of the IAB Transparency and Consent Framework, working groups, and steering committees. So on the agenda today, we want to let you know what is new with TCF, the Transparent Consent Framework, version 2.0. What is the switchover going to look like from version 1.1 to version 2? What do publishers and anyone having a website need to know in order to make this transition? We're also going to walk you through what a user experience should look like with the TCF v2 functionality. And at the end, we're going to leave some time for some Q&A. So I'm now going to pass it off to my colleague, Michael Kraus, to begin us, get us started off with what's new in TCF version 2.
Thanks, Melanie, and hello, everyone, and thank you for taking time out of your days to spend with us, especially in these difficult times. We really appreciate it. So let's talk about what's TCF v2 and why we needed a new version. So the original Transparency and Consent Framework was launched back in April of 2018, so that's more than 2 years ago. And since then, there's been a lot of feedback from different stakeholders about how to best manage the consent and how data is being used in the ecosystem. Additionally, there have been more guidance from the different DPAs about how to interpret the GDPR. And so a lot of this feedback has been taken into consideration to address some of the shortcomings of the original version of the TCF framework. So the new version has more transparency and controls for publishers and for consumers, and creates more clean language and creates better support for legitimate interest data processing. And so based on the stakeholder feedback, changes have been made to make improvements and incorporate that feedback into the framework. Next slide, please. So one of the key things to understand about how the framework works is it helps define the contract between how data is processed from the consumers with the vendors that a particular publisher would be using. So in order to understand how the vendors are using the data, there is a new global vendor list. The global vendor list helps define how the data is going to be used by the vendors. And each vendor in the TCF v2 must declare how they're processing the data, for what purposes, and what legal basis that they're using. And now one of the things that's different in TCF v2 is the vendors can now declare a flexible legal basis, except for purpose one, so that publishers can choose the appropriate legal basis for them to use with their audience. Next slide. So another change in TCF v2 is that there are more finer grained data processing purposes. So in TCF v1, there were 5 different processing purposes defined, and in TCF v2, there's now 10 purposes defined. And each of those purposes has new revised definitions and descriptions, so to provide more clarity about how the data is going to be used. Next slide. In addition to new processing purposes, there are also new data usage categories. And these data usage categories help define 2 different sets of information that might be used by publishers or their vendors. One of them is special purposes, and those have to do with things like being able to technically deliver the ad content or ensure security and prevent fraud and debug their systems. And really these rely on legitimate interest processing. They still have to be disclosed to users, but the vendors don't, the consumers don't opt out on the publisher site. Instead, they would contact the vendors directly to opt out. And then there's special features that are sensitive categories of data that use precise geolocation data as an example, or actively scan device characteristics for identification. This is like fingerprinting. And for those, they must be disclosed separately and they must be able to be opted in. Next slide. One of the things that's not changing is the so-called layered approach. In the layered approach, and this is true in TCF v1 and now in TCF v2, you can define a first layer message, which is the first set of information that a user sees, and also a second layer message, which in our case is the privacy manager. And the first layer message gives the notification, while the second layer message allows the user to make fine-grained controls over about how they want their data to be processed. Next slide, please. Now, as we've seen, there are many new purposes and categories of information. And one of the things that is still true is that all of the processing purposes must be disclosed in the first layer message. Now, as we've increased the number of processing purposes and increased the number of categories, that means there's going to be a lot of information potentially in that first layer message. And so to help deal with that, the IAB has created a new UI element called stacks, which is designed to help reduce the amount of information that is displayed in that first layer message so that it's more consumable by the audience member. You can always expand the stacks to make sure you can see what purposes are underneath, however, so the users always get an idea of what they are agreeing to when they're agreeing to have their data processed. So an example of a stack would be stack 8. And for this stack, the name of the stack is personalized ad and ad measurement. And it includes 4 processing purposes underneath that stack. So there are now 42 different predefined stacks. And publishers can use any of the stacks, but they have to make sure that the names are used exactly as defined by the IAB. And in certain cases, publishers can modify the descriptions, but this is highly discouraged. And the reason it's discouraged is to provide uniformity of the messaging across all of the different properties that a user might be visiting. Next slide. One thing that Sourcepoint can help you use to define how your users' data is going to be processed is if you're dealing with vendors that are actually outside of the IAB framework, or you want to acknowledge that there are processing purposes that are not defined in the IAB framework, you can use custom purposes. And to help communicate those purposes, Sourcepoint has created a disclosure-only custom purpose. So if you have some type of data processing that is essential to your business, you can set up a custom purpose and set it to disclosure only, and this will provide the notification to customers about how their information is being used, but there's no direct opt-out on the notification. Another area where we've mentioned that there are improved controls in TCF v2 is around publisher controls. And with the definition of flexible legal bases by the vendors, publishers can now choose the appropriate legal basis for their audience that they want to use for each vendor. So if there's a flexible legal basis defined, the publisher can switch from the default that the vendor has specified and choose their own legal basis. Please note, this does not mean that the publisher can use a legal basis that the vendor does not support. But it does fix an issue where publishers were finding themselves forced to use a particular purpose and legal basis, even if that's not what they really wanted to do with a particular vendor. Next slide. Another improvement to the TCF v2 framework is that publishers can now write rules for vendors, allowing only certain vendors to process certain data for certain purposes. And so here you can see one of the controls that you might be able to use as a publisher to configure your user experience is you can set the legal basis to user consent, to legitimate interest, or you can say this vendor is not allowed to process this type of data or use this processing purpose with your users. So that's a new addition to TCF v2. Next slide, please. And in addition to flexibility for customers, there's flexibility for users. And so customers can now object in real time to legitimate interest processing. So even if a vendor defines a legal basis of legitimate interest, and that is what's being used by the publisher, consumers can now object to processing the database on legitimate interests. And so that means that they will get a toggle that they can use to shut off a legitimate interest purpose. So that represents a lot of what is new in TCF v2. And now we're going to talk about some of the decisions that you have to make when you are thinking about switching over from TCF v1 to TCF v2. One of the key items to understand is which of your vendors are supporting TCF v2. So the IAB has set some key dates. April 30th, which has already passed for vendors to support and CMPs to support the TCF v2 framework. And then currently June 30th for the 1.1 GVL and framework to no longer be supported. But in order to use TCF v2 with your vendor has to support TCF v2. So what you want to do is discuss with your key vendors when they're planning to join the TCF v2 and coordinate your launch date around the support for those critical vendors. And as an example, Google has said that it will support TCF v2 at the end of Q2. All right, next slide. So another thing that you should think about is how do you want to use your privacy manager and configure your first layer messaging? So with TCF v1 and TCF v2, you can still use a privacy manager as the first layer message. the Privacy Manager provides really fine-grained support and complete transparency to consumers, and you can use it to more easily present region-specific privacy laws in the most full-featured way. On the other hand, having the Privacy Manager as the first layer message means that you might have less opportunity to create text for consumers to help them understand why you're processing their data. And that could lead to consumers rejecting processing of data without fully understanding. And it also means that a reject all button is likely going to be more accessible, meaning that some of your key vendors could be switched off as consumers just decide to reject all processing purposes. So figuring out how you want to configure your first layer message, and if you want to use a privacy manager, is something that you'll have to decide with your commercial and legal teams. Next slide. Okay. So another thing that you're going to have to figure out is if you're going to use stacks, and if you're using stacks, which stacks will you use in the first layer? So stacks do have some rules. You cannot use a stack that has purposes that overlap with another stack that you're already using. You want to make sure that your stacks cover all of your purposes and special features. And you want to make sure that you're providing a compact and clear message in your first layer message so that your consumers understand how their data is being processed and can make appropriate choices. We actually have a tool to help you figure out which stacks to use and if you need to supplement the stacks with purposes. And it is allowable to mix stacks and purposes together in the first layer message. So that is something that you have flexibility around. And in TCF v1, there was a rule that features also had to be displayed in the first layer message. That rule has been relaxed, as well as an earlier rule to force the display of special purposes in the first layer message. So a recent change to the policies in the TCF v2 framework gives more flexibility about whether or not you need to display features and special purposes in the first layer message. Next slide, please. Here's a key item that you're going to have to figure out in your implementation of TCF v2. So with TCF v2, there's more flexibility in how purpose one is used and notified to customers. So purpose one is really a special purpose. It supports GDPR as well as the e-privacy directive about cookies. People cannot claim legitimate interest on purpose one in TCF v2. So it will have to appear as a consent-based item in your privacy manager. However, there are different countries that have different interpretation about how the e-privacy directive should be used. For example, Germany and Norway, under the guidance from the DPAs and the law in those countries, it's not necessary that purpose one needs to necessarily be disclosed. So in the privacy manager, you can configure if you're disclosing purpose one or using a special treatment, but if you're not, you have to use purpose one with a consent-based legal basis. So that's something that you have to verify with your legal teams to align with the laws and regulations in the countries in which you operate. But the CMP should provide you all the flexibility that you need to create the proper consent experience for your audience. Next slide, please. So another area that you have to keep in mind is how are you going to handle the language support? So you want to make sure that your CMP provides all of the standard IAB translations for all of the IAB concepts. And the IAB provides translations into 12 different languages. And for almost all of these concepts, there's no flexibility in how you describe the names or descriptions of the purposes, special features, and special purposes, as well as stacks. Again, publishers in certain circumstances can alter the description of the stack, but again, that is discouraged. And in this case, they would have to provide their own translation. Publishers will have to also provide their own translations of custom purposes. And you can decide what keys to use to figure out what to display to the user, whether or not you set a default setting or use the user's browser setting to decide what language to display your notifications in. Next slide, please. Another key consideration for the TCF is how to present non-TCF vendors and purposes. As we said before, you can include non-TCF vendors and purposes in your notifications, but the policy is they must be visually separated. So you can see here an example of how Sourcepoint lets you separate out the IAB vendors from the non-IAB vendors with a visual cue. Next slide, please. And then another very important question when you're thinking about making the transition from TCF-V1 to TCF-V2 is how easy is it going to be for your organization to implement those changes? How many properties do you have? How many vendors? How many custom purposes are you going to use? And we find that it's really a lot of the discussion that has to happen between your ad operations, commercial, and legal teams that takes up the bulk of the time to figure out how you're going to configure your TCF v2 compliance. You know, the Sourcepoint CMP, for example, is very flexible and easy to configure, and it doesn't really take that much time once you've decided how you want to use it to make that configuration. But if you have a lot of vendors and a lot of different properties, and you have different rules and operate in different regions, you're going to have to take that into consideration when you're planning your transition from TCF-V1 to TCF-V2. So make sure you select a partner who can help you navigate that complexity. All right. So now I'm going to hand it over to Melanie, who's going to give you a UI walkthrough so you can see how some of this works in action.
So I hope you can see my screen now. What I'm showing is a privacy notice, a first layer message for a TCF-V2 implementation on sourcepoint.com. So as we've already kind of gone through a lot of the elements of what is contained, but kind of a live example helps to show you what all the elements are going to look like together and how a user might interact with this. So first layer message, there's a few important elements that need to be shown first in the text on the notice. So some of those important things actually were similar to the TCF version 1.1 requirements. So one of those elements would be about informing the user that you're using cookies to store information, personal data on the device of the user. So that's one key element that needs to be in the first layer message. Another thing is giving some examples of what that might be, such as unique identifiers, information about your browsing patterns, so providing actually concrete examples. Also explaining the notion of legitimate interest to the user and informing them that not all partners are going to ask for consent and might actually rely on a legitimate interest to process data. You should also inform the user that they can always go into their options or privacy settings, whatever you want to call it, so that they can manage their preferences. Another thing that you should tell the users is give them some information about what would happen if they don't give consent. So what is the cons of not providing consent? So in this case, it could be that if you don't provide consent, some personalization of the content or the advertising won't be available. Also informing the user about their consent and what is the scope of that consent. So is it going to apply to this site only, a group of sites, you know, globally, like just to give that user the idea of the scope of the consent is important. And informing them also where they can reopen their preferences at any time. So usually this would be a link on the bottom of the page, just explaining precisely where they can manage their settings. And below our content here, now you can see what we've indicated as the stacks and purposes and custom purposes, and we also have here special features. So we kind of have a mix here of the items which we have chosen to display, and as well as those that are required to display to the users. So within these stacks, we can open these accordions and give the user the full description of what is contained in that stack. So we also have, these are 3 IAB stacks that have been used here. We also have our custom stack here of essential technologies and provided a description of that. And we've also have on the first layer the precise geolocation data, which is a special feature which we have chosen to display on the first layer. So that's pretty much it for the first layer. I mean, the other thing that you'll obviously notice is how prominent it is. It does need to cover a significant proportion of the screen, not to mention that there's a lot of content that needs to go in front of this user. So one thing that's not required on the first layer is that you don't have to have a reject all button. That is not a mandatory option. But what we do have is 2 options here. The vendors, which will take us directly to the list of vendors, or the options, which will take us to the purposes. So now I've opened up our privacy manager. So now I have in front of me those purposes and for which I will be allowed to provide my consent for. These purposes have been set to off by default. And when I open and expand a purpose, I again get the description, and I'm also informed of all those purposes which fall under that particular, or all of those vendors which fall under that particular purpose. As Michael said previously, it's required that you inform the user when and show the differentiation of when a purpose or a vendor is a custom purpose or if it's an IAB purpose. So the top ones are all IAB purposes, and the last one here has been notified with a C as a custom purpose. So these also include those special purposes which aren't required to be shown on the first layer, but which are indicated here and don't give the user the option to opt out. Next, we can go to the legitimate interest tab. So legitimate interest means that we actually, if we claim a legitimate interest, or the vendor claims it, the user can still object to this. And so the user could go in here and actually turn off anything that has been claimed as legitimate interest. This was something that was not previously possible with TCF version 1. And now I will move over to the features. So previously as well with TCF version 1, we did need to display the features. So now we can see the features and those vendors that use those features. We also have an additional feature, which is our special feature, which is use precise geolocation data. This will be set off by default. It would go to on if the user accepts from the first layer, but it would be set to off. And so this one is one where the user can indicate their choice. And again, I can see which vendors are using this particular special feature. And then lastly, I go to my vendors. So now I can see all the vendors which are running on my site. Some of these have been indicated under essential technologies, so I'm not able to opt out of these particular vendors. These vendors here are part of the IAB framework. I can see for each vendor the user, the consent purposes, the special features, and special features that are applicable for that particular vendor. And likewise here, all of these vendors have been indicated as other site vendors with an O because they're not part of the IB framework at this point. But if they are operating with user consent, I have the toggle to be able to opt in or opt out. And lastly, I also have a link to my privacy policy. So that's pretty much it for the privacy manager. So let's say, for example, if I decided to only put on one purpose, I can save my preferences here. And then at the bottom of my page, I can reopen my privacy settings. And you can see that my preferences have been saved. So as with TCF version 1.1, this is still a requirement for TCF v2. So that concludes my UI demo. So I think now it is time to open up the floor for.
Thanks, Melanie. That was great. We've got a lot of really good questions so far. We're going to try to get to all of them in the remaining time. I think we should be able to. So I'm just going to start off with, let's see. First off, there's been a lot of questions about will a recording be sent and is it possible to get access to the slides? Yes, we will be sending the recording out after the webinar, and we can also send you the slides as well. So is active user consent required for legitimate interest?
So that's a great question. So active user consent is not required for a correct legitimate interest processing purpose. What is required in order to process data under the legitimate interest legal basis is that you make a notification to the user that their data is going to be used. However, it is important to note that when a vendor is deciding whether or not, or a publisher is deciding whether or not to use the legitimate interest legal basis, that they should be doing a legitimate interest assessment to make sure that it is the appropriate legal basis to use with that purpose. And it is important for those decisions to get made and for the actual evaluation to happen. So if you have decided that a legitimate interest is going to be the legal basis, then the user does not have to actively consent, but they should be able to object. However, you need to make sure that that is the correct legal basis to use by performing a legitimate interest assessment.
Great. Okay. Here's a very specific question about the Sourcepoint CMP. Are there any plans to expand the options for the background/veil behind the dialog and privacy manager? We would like a native way to choose a blur or put in the front end a static full-scale image from a CDN.
So that's a great question, and what I would suggest is you work with your account management teams to put in a feature request, and we will evaluate that and see what we can do in our next planning cycle.
Great, yes, we always love to get customer feedback and work that into our product roadmap. Great suggestion. Another question asking for clarification about the single stack option. I believe there is a single stack option that contains all the purposes and that you don't have to show the stacks on the second layer. So maybe we could clarify that.
Sure, I can take this one. So there is one stack, 42, which comprises almost all of the purposes. The only purpose that is not comprised in this is purpose 1. So store information on the user's device. So that one can never be part of a stack. It always has to be separate. So that means that at minimum you would have 2, let's call it either purposes or stacks on the first layer being displayed to the user. And then on the second layer, you have the choice to either show the stacks And so that in this way, they would kind of be like a collapsible accordion. So this is actually an option within the Sourcepoint platforms. You can kind of mirror the first layer stacks to the second layer stacks, and then open up the collapsed accordion. Or alternatively, like as we showed in our UI demo, you can have the purposes simply laid out one by one. So this is really just a matter of preferences.
Yeah, and one item just for clarification for those who might not know is that even if you're using stacks, you still do have to provide the purpose level opt-outs for each of the processing purposes represented in the stack. So you can use organize the privacy manager using stacks or not, but you still do have to have the controls to set for the user to set their consent at each purpose.
Great. Here we have a question about the legitimate interest toggles. Are the legitimate interest toggles optional, or are they always present whenever there is any vendor claiming legitimate interest?
Yeah, I would say they are required, and they're there if you have any vendors that are claiming legitimate interest. So if there's no vendors claiming legitimate interest, then these would not be present in the UI.
Here's a question about the privacy manager. Will it be possible to show an accept all button on the privacy manager layer near the save and exit button?
Yes, that is possible. You can have a reject all button, accept all button, save and exit button, cancel button. Those can all be on the second layer.
And one thing to keep in mind when you're planning is there is some recent guidance from DPAs that you have to make it as easy to reject as you do to accept. So if you do have a accept all button in your second layer, strongly consider also having a reject all button.
Okay, here's a great question. Typically, how often is the user prompted to update the CMP settings, and does it have an impact on user churn?
Great question. So this is actually a choice by the publishers or the people who are managing the websites as to how often the message should be displayed. And there are for a number of reasons of when the message should be displayed again. So firstly, the cookies don't last forever in terms of the user's consent preferences. The maximum should be 13 months. But many publishers or companies may decide to have this be a shorter time period, so 6 months or maximum year. This is completely configurable in the Sourcepoint UI. The second reason that you might show another message is due to asking users to consent again because you have added new vendors to your vendor list. So, I mean, not only is this important to inform the user because now they, have additional vendors who are operating and using their data for which they did not provide their consent, but it's also important for the company. Let's say they got a new ad server on board or another very important data processing vendor. They need to quickly get consent for this vendor in order that it can operate effectively to the majority of the users on the site. So we also have what we call scenarios where you can define the user journey as to how often and when a user will be asked to provide their consent again.
Great answer. Let's see. Okay, here's a question about legitimate interest bases. As a publisher, if we decided we don't want to allow a vendor to process data on legitimate interest bases, can we stop this in TCF v2?
Yes.
Yes. Yeah, so you have a couple of options. One, if the vendor has declared a flexible legal basis, even if they declare legitimate interest as the default, you can configure it in your vendor list to be consent. or if the vendor has not declared a flexible legal basis and only declares legitimate interest as their legal basis, then you can set that processing purpose for that vendor to do not allow, and that will prevent that that vendor from processing data based on that purpose.
Here's an interesting question. Are we required to disclose subsidiary vendors in the second layer stack? For example, if we use a blogging platform that's provided by our web host, are we required to list that blogging software developer as essentials technology, or is it sufficient to just list the web host?
I would say the answer to this question is it depends. Is if that subsidiary vendor is processing data. For example, we do have different options for you to display subsidiary vendors to the user. So Google Ad Manager, for example, has a very long list of subsidiary vendors. We have two options to display these vendors to the user, either by providing a link under the vendor's name of Google Ad Manager, or by displaying each vendor one by one under the user or under that particular vendor. In this case, it may also make sense to provide or to add that vendor, the subsidiary vendor, as a vendor as well. So I would say that it just depends on a case-by-case basis as to what might be required, and you might also want to check this with your legal team and also check with the vendor as to whether or not they require a consent signal and how that consent signal can be passed to subsidiary vendors.
Yeah, and I would say definitely check with your legal and privacy teams on how to treat that situation.
Great. Okay, and here's a question about AMP. AMP is always different because of technical restrictions. How are you dealing with that? Do we need to take care of special settings like JavaScript callbacks for special features?
Good question. AMP does have special requirements and has a lot more restrictions. In terms of JavaScript, from my knowledge up until now, AMP pages cannot read JavaScript, so it's not really an option to be able to use that for any special purposes or vendors. So the AMP components are in the process of being updated for TCF v2. So I think it's still a bit of a work in progress, and we'll be learning more as all the information is fully available from Google as to what will be possible in TCF v2 that may have not been previously possible with TCF version 1.
Yeah, and I think one thing that's important to keep in mind is that AMP is what you would call a walled garden, which means that third-party technology like JavaScript is not allowed to run in the AMP context. So all of the interaction with AMP is through an API that Google defines. And so that is what the limiting area is in terms of integration, is what hooks into the AMP context are provided by the vendor.
Here's one of our favorite questions. How do you think the Google Chrome restriction of cookies will affect TCF and privacy, i.e. third-party cookies will no longer exist in Chrome browsers?
Yeah, so I mean, this has already been an issue with Safari. So at least from Sourcepoint side, we already have a solution for this for ensuring that our consent cookies are not going to be deleted after a short period of time. So how we do this is we write the cookies as first-party cookies. So this requires a slightly different technical setup and creating CNAMEd first-party subdomains. So that's how we've been able to work around this so far. And we don't see this being an issue with Chrome either.
Yeah, and while I'd say that Google's decisions are going to have widespread implications in the ecosystem, the TCF framework with its on-page APIs is not really subjected to those cookie limitations.
Great. Okay, so if my website is both an advertiser buying ads from, say, Adform, and also a publisher selling ad inventory ads to Adform, is this use case covered by Sourcepoint?
So I would say that if the vendors is going to be on the site for multiple purposes, so what you have is the option to add this vendor under multiple purposes. So first, all of the IAB purposes, which are a lot of them are advertising purposes, but then you have the option to add custom purposes. So you could have purposes such as retargeting or you know, additional other options. So you could add this particular vendor under multiple purposes and decide on which ones what you might deem as legitimate interests or are user consent. So you have a lot of flexibility with regards to choosing how a vendor should be represented.
Okay, it looks like we have time for a couple more questions in the remaining minutes. The question about, this is interesting, are there any TCF v2 purposes that are not related to advertising?
I'm going to double check. I mean, definitely you have a fair number of purposes here. For example, if we're looking at even the special purposes or special features like precise geolocation data, this might not actually have anything to do with advertising. So let's take a look. Measurement performance. So you might be measuring content performance. This might not actually be having anything to do with ads. It could be actually the content of the site. Applying market research. This might not have anything to do with advertising on the site, as well as developing and improving products. Another one that might not necessarily have to do with advertising. So there's like a good couple that are not specifically, obviously, advertising related. Even personalized content, this could have to do with just the content of the site itself and not necessarily about advertising. Definitely.
Great. Well, I think that's all the time we have today. If there's any open questions, we will follow up with you via email and make sure, please also reach out to us if you didn't get a satisfactory answer to any of your questions. We'd love to keep the conversation going. And you can check out additional material about TCF v2 on our blog. And of course, you can read the TCF v2 policies themselves on iabeurope.eu. And we'd love to do a personalized demo for you if you haven't had one already. So again, please reach out to us at info@sourcepoint.com. Thanks so much. Have a great day.
Thanks very much, everyone.
Thanks, everyone. Bye-bye. Stay healthy
Bye.
and stay safe.